Nestled deep in a secluded valley lay the village of Hollow Creek. Its inhabitants were simple folk, living off the land and upholding traditions passed down through generations. The village was ancient, its origins lost to the mists of time. A sense of peace pervaded the air, yet a shadow lingered at the edge of the valley. It was the imposing presence of the Whispering Woods. The woods stood as a stark contrast to the tranquil village. They were ancient, filled with towering trees and shrouded in perpetual twilight. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting long, eerie shadows. Unlike the welcoming fields surrounding Hollow Creek, the woods seemed to repel all who dared approach. The villagers of Hollow Creek rarely spoke of the woods. Those who did spoke in hushed tones, their voices filled with fear and respect. They believed the woods were a place of mystery and danger, a place where the veil between the living world and the spirit world was thin. For as long as anyone could remember, the legend of the Whispering Woods had been passed down through generations of villagers. It was a tale whispered around hearths, meant to instill caution and fear into the hearts of children. The legend spoke of ancient spirits that resided within the forest's depths. These were not the benevolent spirits of nature often celebrated in folklore. These were restless souls, unable to find peace, their voices trapped between this world and the next. It was said that as night fell upon the woods, the whispers began. Some whispered of forgotten secrets, their voices faint and mournful, carried on the wind through the trees. Others spoke of warnings, their tones urgent and filled with a desperate need to be heard. But there were those who whispered of darker things. Their voices were filled with malice and hatred, tempting unsuspecting souls deeper into the woods, promising knowledge and power in exchange for something far more sinister. It was said that those who ventured into the Whispering Woods after dark were never quite the same. Thomas was different from the other villagers. While most of them grew up believing the stories, he remained skeptical. He was a young man full of curiosity and a thirst for adventure. His mind craved logical explanations, not tales whispered in fear. Thomas had heard the stories countless times, each telling more outlandish than the last. He'd listened patiently as his elders spoke of the whispers, of the strange occurrences within the woods, and of those who had ventured in never to return. But Thomas refused to accept these stories at face value. He saw the fear in the eyes of the storytellers. He heard the tremor in their voices, but he also sensed something else, a desperate need to believe. To Thomas, the legend of the Whispering Woods was nothing more than a way for the villagers to explain the unknown. It was a way for them to cope with their fear of the dark and the mysteries that lay beyond their understanding. One cool autumn evening, as the villagers of Hollow Creek gathered in the dimly lit tavern, the conversation inevitably turned to the Whispering Woods. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls as the villagers shared their stories. Thomas listened with a mixture of amusement and frustration. He couldn't understand their blind acceptance of these tales. As the night wore on and the ale flowed freely, the stories grew more elaborate, each one fueling the flames of fear in the hearts of the listeners. Finally, Thomas had enough. He slammed his mug down on the table, silencing the room. "Enough with these ghost stories," he scoffed. "It's just a forest. There's nothing to be afraid of." His words hung in the air, met with stunned silence. The villagers stared at him, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Old Man Hemlock, his face weathered by years of hard work and worry, leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "You shouldn't speak so carelessly, boy," he warned. "The woods are no place for those who don't believe." Thomas stood his ground. "Oh, and what will these spirits do if I dare to enter their domain?" he challenged. Section 5. Entering the Woods. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the village of Hollow Creek as Thomas stood at the edge of the Whispering Woods. He had ignored the pleas of his fellow villagers and their warnings about venturing into the forest so late in the day. He was determined to prove them wrong, to expose the legend of the Whispering Woods for the fabrication he believed it to be. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The woods were eerily silent, the only sound the beating of his own heart. As he took his first tentative steps into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The trees, ancient and gnarled, seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The sunlight, already fading, struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and shifted with every gust of wind. Despite his skepticism, a shiver ran down Thomas's spine. The woods were unsettling, even in the daylight. Section 6. The Whispers begin. As Thomas ventured deeper into the Whispering Woods, the forest floor became a tangled mess of roots and undergrowth, making his progress slow and laborious. The air grew heavy, thick with humidity and the smell of decaying leaves. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, but whether from exertion or fear, he couldn't be sure. The silence that had greeted him at the edge of the woods was gone, replaced by a cacophony of sounds. Twigs snapped under his feet, birds called out in alarm, and the wind rustled the leaves in the trees above, creating a symphony of noise that set his teeth on edge. And then he heard them. At first they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of the leaves, but as he pressed on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around him, swirling around his head like a vortex of sound. He could make out words, phrases, but they were jumbled, nonsensical. They spoke of forgotten memories, of long-lost loves, of unspeakable horrors that made his blood run cold. Fear, primal and instinctive, began to gnaw at the edges of Thomas's resolve. He quickened his pace, desperate to break free from the oppressive atmosphere of the woods. Section 7. Lost and Afraid. The sun had vanished below the horizon, plunging the Whispering Woods into darkness. The last vestiges of daylight clung to the sky, casting an eerie, otherworldly glow on the surrounding trees. Thomas was hopelessly lost. He had been wandering through the forest for what felt like hours, his initial confidence replaced by a growing sense of dread. The whispers had intensified, their voices now a constant drone in his ears. They seemed to be leading him, guiding him deeper into the heart of the woods. He tried to retrace his steps, to find his way back to the familiar path that led to Hollow Creek, but it was no use. Every turn he took seemed to lead him further astray. He was trapped in a labyrinth of trees, his every move dictated by the unseen forces that surrounded him. Panic began to set in. He stumbled through the undergrowth, his clothes torn, his body scratched and bruised. The whispers taunted him, mocked his fear, and reveled in his despair. They whispered of things he couldn't understand, of secrets that chilled him to the bone. He wanted to scream, to silence the voices that echoed in his head, but he knew it was futile. He was alone, lost and hunted in the heart of the Whispering Woods. Section 8. Finding his way out. Through the darkness and his terror, Thomas saw a light. It flickered in the distance, small and faint, but a beacon of hope nonetheless. He stumbled towards it, his legs heavy, his lungs burning. The whispers intensified, urging him to turn back, to surrender to the darkness. But the light spurred him on. As he drew closer, he realized it was a fire, small and contained, built against the base of a massive oak tree. A figure sat huddled beside it, shrouded in shadow. Thomas approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, the figure stood, revealing itself to be an old woman. Her face was etched with wrinkles, her eyes filled with a wisdom that spoke of countless seasons spent within the woods. She didn't seem surprised to see him, as if she had been expecting his arrival. "Lost, are you, child?" she asked, her voice raspy with age. Thomas could only nod, too exhausted to speak. The old woman gestured towards the fire. "Rest, child," she said. "The woods can be a dangerous place at night. even for those who know their secrets. Section 9. The legend continues. Thomas awoke with the first rays of dawn, his body stiff and sore. He was lying beneath the same oak tree where he had encountered the old woman the night before, but she was gone. He sat up, his head spinning, and looked around. The whispers were gone, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest waking. He could see the edge of the whispering woods just a short distance away. Relief washed over him, followed by a wave of shame and exhaustion. He had been a fool to dismiss the stories of the villagers, to underestimate the power of the woods. He had faced his fears and emerged from the experience forever changed. Thomas returned to Hollow Creek a different man. He kept the events of that night to himself, knowing that no one would believe him. He had entered the Whispering Woods a skeptic, but he had left a believer. The legend of the Whispering Woods lived on, passed down through generations of villagers, a cautionary tale of the dangers that lurked within its depths. And though he never ventured into the woods after dark again, Thomas could still hear the whispers in his dreams, reminding him of the night he had faced the unknown and lived to tell the tale.